Wales, 1944. The valleys stretched green and steep under skies heavy with Atlantic rain, coal towns clinging to hillsides that had sustained generations of Welsh families. In a community centre outside Bridgend, Margaret Davies reviewed supply lists by lamplight, her weaver's hands ink-stained as she calculated yarn requirements for the coming month. 6 miles north, behind wire fencing and brick guard buildings, 32 German women stood at evening roll call at Camp 100, Island Farm, their grey uniforms bearing the marks of North African field stations and Mediterranean crossings. They had been told British camps were forced labour operations where prisoners were exploited without mercy. They would soon be handed woodworking tools and craft materials that contradicted everything they knew about captivity. The war had scattered strange cargo across Britain's industrial heartland, prisoners by the hundreds of thousands. But these were not the expected prisoners. Not the U-boat commanders filling camps in Scotland. Not the Luftwaffe officers in Yorkshire. These were women, auxiliary personnel mostly, some radio operators, young women conscripted into the Nachrichtenhelferinnen and support services, captured when Allied forces swept through Sicily and southern Italy. When the campaigns ended in retreat and chaos, none of them had imagined Wales. Camp 100 occupied former farmland that had been requisitioned in 1943. Its boundaries marked by wire that cut across ancient field patterns, its buildings constructed with wartime efficiency. The women had arrived on a Wednesday morning in October, stepping from military trucks into cold that carried the taste of coal smoke and sea salt. Sergeant Dorothy Evans, Women's Auxiliary Air Force, watched them file past, noting their exhaustion, their apprehension, the way they moved with military discipline despite obvious fear. The prisoners ranged in age from 20 to 46. Most had been signals operators and clerks in North Africa. A few had served with medical support units. Some had been seamstresses and teachers before conscription. All had been processed through holding facilities in Italy before the Channel crossing. Then trains through southern England and into Wales to this place where valleys echoed with chapel hymns and the air smelled of industry and rain. They had expected exploitation. Instead, they found something bewildering. The camp commandant, Major Catherine Reynolds, had managed women's auxiliary services since 1941. She understood organisation, understood that idle prisoners became problems, while productive prisoners maintained dignity. These women were different from typical military captives, skilled in their own ways. She saw in their faces not just exhaustion, but capability, the kind of practical competence that could be channeled productively. Your status is protected by international law, she told them through an interpreter, a Welsh-speaking German émigré named Mrs. Thomas. You will work in community services. The labour is therapeutic and useful, but the treatment is lawful. Any mistreatment will be reported. Any escape attempt will result in consequences. The women stood silent in the assembly hall. Through the windows, they could see Welsh valleys, terraced houses climbing hillsides, a landscape of organised industriousness, nothing like the chaos of Italy or the devastation of their homeland. This was a landscape that spoke of continuity, of communities that had endured through hardship. That night in the barracks, they whispered in German while guards patrolled outside. "They will make us work the mines," someone said. "Break rocks until we die." Helene Schneider, a former signals operator who had served with communications units in Tunisia, stared at the ceiling. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "but at least we are alive to fear it." Margaret Davies was 44 years old and running a community craft centre her mother had founded in 1920. Weaving workshops, woodworking classes, textile production that supplemented rationed clothing. Her husband was in the Merchant Navy, convoy duty in the Atlantic. Her son had died at Tobruk. Her daughter worked in a munitions factory in Birmingham. She managed the centre with whatever help she could find, but Wales had been emptied of skilled craftspeople. The work remained. When the Ministry of Information representative arrived to discuss prisoner labour, Margaret sat in the centre's office and listened to the proposal. German women POWs, the official explained. Educated women with skills who need productive occupation. You need workers for craft production. The government supervises the arrangement. You provide materials, instruction, basic courtesy. Margaret looked at the community centre around her, at looms sitting idle and woodworking benches gathering dust. She thought about propaganda she had heard about Germans, about the Blitz that had killed her cousin in Cardiff. She thought about her son buried in North Africa. How many? She asked. 8, the official said. They will work 4 days weekly. You provide materials, supervision, treat them according to regulations. Margaret nodded slowly. The community would not wait for her to resolve her grief about enemies. Send them Monday, she said. They arrived in a military van on a Monday when autumn rain made the valleys grey and mist obscured the hilltops. 8 women in worn uniforms stepped down onto wet pavement, their faces carefully neutral, their posture tense. Margaret watched from the centre's entrance, her assistant Helen Roberts standing beside her. They look like they expect chains, Helen said quietly. Perhaps they do, Margaret replied. Sergeant Evans approached with paperwork. These are your workers, Mrs. Davies. Several speak adequate English. The one called Helene speaks it well. They understand basic expectations. I return at 3 o'clock. Margaret nodded. She walked across the room, footsteps loud on wooden floors, and stopped 12 feet from the women. They stood in formation, hands at their sides, eyes scanning the room with barely concealed confusion. She could see them taking in the looms, the woodworking tools, the craft materials displayed on shelves. You will work in craft production, Margaret said clearly. Weaving, woodworking, textile work. You will have proper materials and instruction. We break for lunch at noon. You follow safety procedures and produce quality work. Questions? Helene stepped forward slightly. Her English carried a heavy accent, but was clear. We understand, Mrs. Davies. We will work. Margaret studied her face. She was perhaps 27, with brown hair pinned back practically, eyes that carried the wariness of someone who had learned to expect nothing good. There was no defiance in her expression, but no submission either, just a kind of watchful uncertainty. Very well, Margaret said. Helen will show you the facilities and explain what we produce. They walked to the workshop area, 8 women and 1 assistant, their figures dwarfed by the craft equipment. Margaret watched from her office, a feeling she could not name settling in her chest like cold rain. The first days were silent labour. The women worked with careful precision, approaching the craft tools with obvious confusion, following instructions with mechanical obedience. They did not complain. They did not question. When Margaret brought tea at mid-morning, they drank quickly but kept their distance. Helen reported they were capable workers, better than anticipated. They know textiles, she told Margaret. Several of them. They handle fabric like they've worked with it before, and they're meticulous with measurements. By Wednesday, Margaret noticed Helene watching the craft materials with something like disbelief. That evening, she asked Sergeant Evans about it. The officer shrugged. They have been in camps and combat zones for 18 months, she said. First in Africa, then in holding facilities, then processing centres. They expected forced labour, punishment work. Your craft centre probably makes no sense to them, prisoners being given quality tools and materials. Thursday morning was the day Margaret's understanding shifted. She was in her office when she heard raised voices in the workshop. One of the women, a young prisoner named Katerina, who could not have been more than 22, was arguing with Helen about a weaving pattern. The girl was insisting the pattern was wrong, that it would waste yarn. Margaret and Helen approached. She says the warp threads are spaced incorrectly. Helene translated when they arrived, speaking quickly. That the pattern as written will produce fabric that is too loose, will waste materials. She was a weaver before the war. She knows this work. Margaret examined the pattern, then looked at the loom setup. The girl was right. The specifications would produce substandard fabric. "Show me the correct spacing," Margaret said to Katerina. Katerina looked at her with visible surprise, then at Helene for translation confirmation. She approached the loom tentatively and demonstrated proper warp spacing, explaining through Helene about tension and thread count and fabric quality. "You are correct," Margaret said when the demonstration finished. "Change all the looms to this spacing, and thank you for noticing the error." Katerina stared at her, incomprehension clear on her face. She said something rapidly in German. "She asks why you listen to a prisoner," Helene translated quietly. "Why you do not punish her for questioning the pattern." Margaret looked at this girl who had expected punishment for competence, for preventing waste, for knowing her craft. "Because good work is good work," she said. "Because knowledge deserves respect, regardless of who possesses it." That evening, sitting in her cottage after the van had taken them back to camp, Margaret thought about Katerina's confusion, about how she had expected punishment for expertise. The propaganda had not prepared her for this, for prisoners who had been taught that competence would be punished. Friday arrived with production pressures from the Ministry of Supply. Textile quotas needed filling, supplementary clothing items for the war effort. By mid-morning, Margaret was reviewing the work and noticed the German women working with unusual efficiency, their movements coordinated like they had worked together before. Helene approached her cautiously. "Mrs. Davies," she said, "if you permit, we could organise the workflow differently. The way we did in German textile factories, more efficient for this type of production." Margaret looked at this enemy prisoner offering advice on running her centre. Every instinct told her to refuse. Accepting guidance from prisoners seemed wrong. But she remembered Katerina's expertise, remembered waste that had been prevented. "Show me," she said. Helene explained a reorganisation of the workspace, a system of sequential stations that reduced movement and improved quality control. It was logical, it was efficient, it was better than their current arrangement. "Implement it," Margaret said. "Let us see if German methods work here." The reorganisation transformed the production. Materials flowed smoother, quality improved, quotas suddenly became achievable. Helen watched with grudging respect as the system proved itself. At day's end, she approached Margaret quietly. "They taught us something," she said. "The Germans made us more efficient." "Good craftspeople are good craftspeople," Margaret replied. "War does not change skill." That evening, at Camp 100, Helene wrote a letter to her mother in Stuttgart. The mail would go through military censors, arrive months late if it arrived at all, but she wrote anyway. "Dear Mutti," she began, "we are somewhere in Britain, in Wales. We work in a craft centre. Today, I thought we would be slaves breaking rocks. Instead, they gave us weaving looms and woodworking tools. They asked our advice on production. They listened when we suggested improvements. I do not understand this captivity." In her cottage, Margaret sat at her writing desk and wrote to her husband at sea. "I have German prisoners working the crafts now," she wrote, "women from signals units. They are not what I expected. Today, they improved our production efficiency. They know their crafts better than some British workers. What kind of war is this, where enemies teach each other better methods?" These letters would cross in the mail, carried by military postal systems across oceans and battle zones, arriving to recipients who would read them and understand that the war was not what anyone had imagined, that it was more complicated and more human and more strange than any propaganda had prepared them for. October became November. The women came 4 days weekly, worked the crafts, improved production standards, returned to camp each evening. Margaret learned their names, their backgrounds in fragments. Helene was from Stuttgart, had been a radio operator before capture. Katerina had worked in a textile mill in Bavaria. Ingrid was older, 38, had been a furniture maker before conscription. They learned Welsh expressions. Quetch, bach, tidy. the rhythms of Valley Welsh that made their German accents sound almost musical. Margaret learned some German. Gut, schön, vorsichtig, the language of workshop courtesy. Helen, who had been sceptical at first, became their defender. They work harder than some Welsh workers I've known, she told Margaret, and they never cut corners on quality. The other community members, elderly craftspeople and women managing homes while men were overseas, watched the arrangement with varying degrees of acceptance. Some muttered about Germans in British workshops. Others saw only skilled workers who maintained standards. A few, like old Mrs. Evans, who had lost 3 brothers in the Great War, refused to speak to them at all, but did not interfere. Margaret's neighbour, union organiser David Thomas, stopped by one afternoon. "Heard you have Germans working the looms," he said. "I have skilled workers," Margaret replied. "That is all." "People are concerned," David said. "Some worry you are taking work from British women, that you treat prisoners too well, give them real tools. The Geneva Convention requires useful occupation and humane treatment," Margaret said. "I am following international law, and the work gets done better." "Better and British are not always the same thing," David said. Then he looked at Margaret for a long moment. "But your production numbers are up 40%. The ministry is pleased. Perhaps skill deserves tools after all." In late November, Helene approached Margaret with a request. She spoke carefully, aware she was pushing boundaries. "The woodworking area," she said. "Some of us worked with wood before the war. We could create items beyond basic production. Furniture, decorative pieces. It would keep skills sharp, produce items the community could use." Margaret considered. It violated no regulations she knew of, might even enhance community relations. But it meant giving prisoners creative freedom, allowing enemy input into what the community would see and use. "What items?" she asked. "What do German craftspeople make differently?" "Functional pieces with simple beauty," Helene said. "Chairs, small tables, carved boxes, quality work that serves purpose." Margaret nodded slowly. "You can make them," she said, "but they serve the community, not just the camp. Items are distributed to families who need them most." Helene's face showed surprise, then something like professional satisfaction. "That is fair, Mrs. Davies. That is how craft should work." The furniture project transformed workshop culture. The women created pieces with the same precision they brought to textile work, but with something else too. Something like pride, like connection to their craft traditions. They carved and assembled with meticulous care, creating items that were simple but beautifully made. The British craftspeople initially resisted, suspicious of German designs. Then they experienced the quality, sturdy construction, elegant simplicity, work that spoke of deep training and professional standards. Helen helped finish and deliver the pieces. The Germans labelled each item with a small mark indicating the workshop, creating a bilingual signature of collaborative production. They worked together on the projects, prisoner and free worker, united by standards that transcended nationality. December brought quotas that seemed impossible. Winter clothing was desperately needed. The centre received orders that would require extended hours and maximum efficiency. Margaret gathered everyone in the workshop, British and German workers together. "We have 8 weeks to produce items that would normally take 5 months," she said. "If we fail, people suffer in the cold. I need everyone working at peak efficiency. No one is asked to compromise their integrity, but everyone is asked to do their best work. Questions?" Katerina raised her hand tentatively. "If we work additional hours, what happens?" Margaret looked at her steadily. "You receive credit toward improved camp conditions, and you receive the same respect for the same work as everyone else." The workshop erupted in coordinated activity. British and German workers organising production like a single entity. Knowledge flowing across language barriers. Professional standards overcoming political differences. The 8 weeks became a sustained effort of collaborative craftsmanship. On a Tuesday in December, something unexpected happened. A bombing raid sirens sounded, German aircraft approaching South Wales. Everyone rushed to shelters, everyone except the German prisoners, who stood frozen in the workshop, uncertain whether they were allowed to seek safety. Margaret ran back from the shelter entrance. "Come on," she shouted. "German bombs do not check nationality." Helene hesitated. "We are prisoners, Mrs. Davies." "Perhaps we are not permitted. Perhaps you should not be stupid," Margaret interrupted. "A bomb kills everyone. Move!" They ran together to the shelter, British and German workers huddled in the same underground space, while explosions shook the ground above. In the darkness, with death falling from their own countrymen's aircraft, the boundaries seemed absurd. When the all-clear sounded and they emerged to find the centre intact, something had shifted. That evening, old Mrs. Evans offered Helene a cigarette. Helene accepted. They smoked together in silence, two women who had survived the same bombing, craftspeople who happened to be enemies. January 1945 brought a challenge that tested everything. A large furniture order failed quality inspection. Joints were failing, wood splitting, structural integrity compromised. Production was halted. Margaret gathered the senior workers, British and German, together. "We have a quality problem," she said. "Something in our process is creating weakness. Find the issue. I do not care who identifies it or what method you use. Just find it." For 3 days, mixed teams analysed every construction step. Helene and Helen worked together, examining wood selection and treatment. Katerina and old craftsman Evan traced assembly procedures and finishing processes. On the 4th day, Ingrid identified the issue: improper wood drying that left moisture causing later warping. The solution required modifying storage procedures and changing assembly timing. "It will require 5 days of production delay to implement properly," Ingrid told Margaret. "But it will solve the quality issue permanently and improve all future work." "Implement it," Margaret said. "If a German prisoner can solve a problem that affects British production, then her solution deserves implementation." The modification worked. Quality improved dramatically. Production resumed at higher standards. The ministry inspector who reviewed the operation asked who designed the solution. "My senior woodworker," Margaret said, gesturing at Ingrid. "One of my most skilled craftspeople." The inspector looked at Ingrid's prisoner uniform, then at Margaret. "Unconventional," he said carefully, "but the results are impressive." February arrived with news of Allied advances into Germany. The war was clearly ending. Germany's defeat was becoming inevitable. At Camp 100, the prisoners received the news with complex emotions. The war was ending, but they were winning nothing. On the workshop floor, the dynamic became strained. The German workers were quieter, more withdrawn. Helene moved through her tasks mechanically, the precision still perfect, but the engagement diminished. When Margaret asked what was wrong, she shook her head. "My mother is in Stuttgart," she said finally. "The bombing there is continuous. I do not know if she is alive. I am safe here in Wales, making furniture and textiles, and my family may be dying." Margaret had no words for this. What could she say? That the bombs were necessary, that Germany had started this, that her mother was the enemy. All true and all inadequate in the face of her anguish. "I am sorry," she said. "It is all I can offer, but I am sorry." Helene looked at her with exhausted eyes. "You have a husband at sea?" "Yes," Margaret confirmed. "On convoy duty, where U-boats hunt." "Then you understand," Helene said. "The fear, the not knowing, the impossibility of celebrating victories when you do not know who has been lost." "I understand," Margaret said. They stood together in the workshop, a Welsh craftswoman and a German radio operator, both waiting for news of people they loved in places being destroyed, both trapped in circumstances neither had chosen, both trying to maintain dignity through good work. Spring settled over the valleys, bringing longer days and increased production pressure. The workshop work continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Margaret noticed the German workers speaking less, the professional camaraderie strained by the approaching end. Helene asked Margaret if they could create a memorial piece in the workshop. "A carved panel," she said, "listing the craftspeople who worked here, British and German names together, acknowledging the work we did." Margaret considered. It violated no regulations she knew of, but it acknowledged something authorities might find uncomfortable, that German prisoners had contributed meaningfully to British community production. "Why?" she asked. "Because the work matters," Helene said. "Because what we built together matters. Because craft transcends politics. Because I want to remember that enemies can create beauty side by side." Margaret nodded slowly. "Make it," she said. "But it lists craftspeople, not nationalities, just names and the work they did." Ingrid carved the panel with meticulous detail. British and German names intermixed. No hierarchy, no separation. Just craftspeople who had worked these tools, created these pieces, maintained these standards. April brought orders that changed everything. The German prisoners at Camp 100 would be redistributed as the war ended. Those with skills would be transferred to larger facilities for eventual repatriation. Helene and her group would be moved to a processing centre in the Midlands. The final week they came to the workshop, everyone worked quietly. The equipment they had organised ran smoothly, the systems they had created functioning perfectly. Everything was the same, and everything was ending. On their final Thursday, Margaret closed the workshop early. She gathered everyone, British and German workers, together and brought out tea and small cakes she had made from saved rations. They sat in the workshop they had shared, eating together despite regulations that discouraged fraternisation. The boundaries that had once seemed absolute now meant nothing. "I have something for each of you," Margaret said. She distributed small packages wrapped in cloth. Inside each was a hand-carved tool handle created from workshop wood, engraved with the centre's name and the year 1944 to 1945. "So you remember," Margaret said, "so you can show people that enemies work together here, that craft standards transcended politics, that good work is good work regardless of who creates it." Helene held her tool handle with trembling hands. "In Germany," she said, "we were told British would use us as slaves, that we would be worked to death in mines, that we were expendable labour." "In Britain," Margaret replied, "we were told Germans were fanatics who rejected all civilization, that they were all Nazis who deserved no consideration." "Yet here we are," Helene said. "Yet here we are," Margaret agreed. Katerina, one of the younger prisoners, spoke up in careful English. "When I return to Bavaria, if Bavaria still exists, I will tell people. Tell them about the Welsh workshop that gave us tools instead of chains, that listened to our expertise, that treated us like craftspeople." "Tell them it does not have to be like this," Margaret said. "Tell them craft standards are universal. Tell them good work deserves respect, regardless of nationality." The van arrived at dusk. Sergeant Evans helped them load their few possessions, her expression respectful now rather than merely professional. The women climbed in one by one. Helene was last. She paused at the door and looked back at Margaret. "Thank you, Mrs. Davies," she said, "for treating us like craftspeople, for teaching us that enemies can create beauty together when they share professional respect." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. The van pulled away down the valley road, Welsh hills darkening in evening. 8 women in worn uniforms disappearing toward an uncertain future. Helen stood beside Margaret, watching until the vehicle vanished into the twilight. "You did something important," she said quietly. "I gave them tools and treated them fairly," Margaret replied. "That is all." "You showed that craft transcends politics," Helen said, "in a war that tried to make everything about ideology. That is more than tools. That is how we rebuild when this ends." August 1945. the war ended. Helene and the others were eventually repatriated, processed through holding centres, transported home to a Germany that no longer existed as they remembered it. They landed in occupied zones, were transported by train through devastation, saw their homeland for the first time in years. The Germany they returned to was not the Germany they had left. Cities were rubble, infrastructure was destroyed, families were scattered or dead. Helene found her mother alive in Stuttgart, living in a bombed-out apartment with 4 other families. Bavaria, where Katharina had worked, was occupied and transforming. But they carried with them something unexpected. A memory of an enemy who had been fair, of a place called Wales, where craft standards had mattered more than nationality, of tools freely given and respect earned through competence. A Welsh craftswoman who had a son buried by German armies but still treated German prisoners like skilled workers. In September 1945, a letter arrived at the centre. It had been opened by military censors, stamped with occupation authority seals, forwarded through channels. Margaret sat at her desk and read it. "Dear Mrs. Davies," it began, "I am writing from Stuttgart. I wanted you to know that I survived the journey home, that I found my mother alive. Germany is destroyed, but we will rebuild with the skills you helped us maintain. I wanted to thank you for your treatment during our time at your centre. I learned more about Britain from you than from any propaganda. I learned that craft standards can unite enemies, that good work transcends politics. The tool handle you gave me is precious to me. I keep it with my important possessions. Someday, when the world is sane again, I hope to return to Wales and see the workshop one more time. Until then, I remember the respect and the tools. And I tell everyone I meet that not all enemies are monsters. Some are just craftspeople caught in circumstances beyond their control. Thank you for teaching me this. Helene Schneider." Margaret read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer with her husband's letters from the convoy runs, her son's medals from North Africa, the other things she considered worth preserving. Years later, historians would note that approximately 400,000 German prisoners worked in Britain during World War II. A small percentage were women, captured serving in auxiliary and support roles. They worked in hospitals, farms, workshops, craft centres across the country. Their labour filling gaps left by Britons serving overseas. Most of these encounters were unremarkable. Prisoners worked, guards supervised, protocols were followed. But in places, something else happened. Small acts of respect that defied propaganda. Moments of professional recognition that transcended enmity. A craft centre in Wales where enemies worked side by side. Tools given freely. Furniture created together. The lesson that good work is good work regardless of who creates it. Margaret Davies continued running the centre until 1968, when age and arthritis forced her to retire. The workflow systems the prisoners had created were still in use, maintained by subsequent craftspeople. The carved panel with mixed British and German names hung in the centre's main room, weathered but preserved. Helene Schneider became a vocational training instructor in Stuttgart, working on reconstruction education programs. She never forgot Wales, never forgot the lesson that craft standards transcend nationality. In 1970, she wrote an article for a craft journal about her war experiences. It was titled "Tools and Respect in the Enemy's Workshop." Katharina returned to Bavaria, became a master weaver, trained apprentices. She told students about the Welsh Craft Centre, where German and British workers had produced textiles together, where professional excellence had mattered more than propaganda. Her students grew up knowing their instructor had once been Britain's prisoner, and Britain had given her tools and listened to her expertise. The incident that had seemed so strange, enemies working together, sharing knowledge, creating beautiful items side by side, became part of the larger story of World War II's complexity. The story of how professional standards dissolved propaganda, how craft competence created common ground, how a Welsh craft centre manager and German prisoners found mutual respect in good work and fair treatment. Camp 100 closed in 1948. The buildings were dismantled, the wire removed, the guard posts torn down. The site returned to other uses, but for a period during the war, it had been a place where enemies learned to work together, where hatred was tempered by professional respect, where understanding grew in unlikely soil. December 1979. Margaret Davies, now 79 years old, sat in her cottage and talked with a craft historian recording oral histories of wartime production. "What do you remember most about the German prisoners?" the historian asked. "The tools," Margaret said. "The day we gave them tools, and they could not believe it." "Why that moment?" "Because that is when I understood what we had done to each other," Margaret replied. "Not just the governments, not just the militaries. Us, working people. We had been taught to see each other as enemies, and it took craft tools to prove we were all just people trying to do good work." "Did it change how you saw the war?" Margaret was quiet for a long time. "It showed me the war was necessary, but the hatred was not," she said finally. "That we could fight without dehumanizing, that professional standards are international. I wish more people had understood that." The interview concluded. The historian packed up his equipment and drove away. Margaret sat alone in her cottage, looking at photographs of her workshop, at the carved panel with mixed names, at the carved box Helene had sent her years later as a gift when they reconnected in the 1960s. Somewhere in Stuttgart, an elderly woman named Helene kept a photograph on her desk. 8 women in prisoner uniforms standing in a British craft workshop, holding tools they had been given freely. Behind them, looms and workbenches. Above them, Welsh Valley light. Between them and the camera, a distance measured not in miles, but in choices. The choice to give prisoners real tools. The choice to value competence over nationality. The choice to maintain craft standards when exploitation would have been easier. The war had ended decades ago. The workshop had been modernised multiple times. But the lesson remained, carved in Welsh oak, enduring still. That craft standards transcend nationality, that good work is good work regardless of who creates it, and that respect earned through skill is respect that endures. One tool freely given at a time, one collaborative solution, one carved panel with names organised by craft rather than politics. The valleys still echoed with industry, though the mines had closed and the economy had evolved. The craft traditions still passed through generations, and the story endured, like the best stories do, because it told a truth people needed to hear. That even in the worst of times, professional respect survives if we choose to let it. That propaganda crumbles when confronted with the universal language of good work. That the distance between enemy and colleague is nothing more than the choice to value competence over ideology. The workshop stood renovated eventually, adapted for new community needs, but the panel remained, marking the place where 8 German prisoners learned that captivity could include dignity. Where a Welsh craftswoman proved that professional standards transcend nationality. Where craft tools became something more than implements, they became bridges across an abyss of propaganda and fear. And in that small act of giving prisoners quality tools, of valuing their expertise and listening to their improvements, Margaret Davies demonstrated what historians would spend decades trying to articulate, that the true victory in any conflict is not the defeat of armies, but the preservation of our capacity to recognise competence and maintain professional standards even in those we are taught to hate.